Hello, and welcome to episode, episode 186 of the Chills of Will podcast. Pleasure today to be joined by Stephanie Feldman. Here's a bit about Stephanie. She is the author of the novels Saturnalia and The Angel of Losses, which is a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writer selection, winner of the Crawford Fantasy Award and finalist for the Mythopoeic. I was going to ask you how to pronounce it. I should ask you before. Mythopoeic?
Mythopoeic.
I'm sorry, one more time?
Mythopoeic.
I was totally not even close.
Yeah, I only learned about it when, I got that recognition.
For the Mythopoeic Award. She is co-editor of the multi-genre anthology Who Will Speak for America, and her stories and essays have appeared in or are forthcoming from Asimov's Science Fiction, Catapult Magazine, Electric Literature, Flash Fiction Online, the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, the Rumpus, Uncharted Magazine, Volume 1 Brooklyn, Weird Horror, and more. She lives outside Philadelphia with her family. Thanks so much for joining me. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. It's so great to talk to you. You're such a the book Saturnalia is so innovative, so creative. I'm really looking forward to talking to you, not just about that, but about everything else. I'd love to know about your beginnings. Like, were you the library kid? Were you the one whose family had magazines and books all over the place? Were you science fiction kid? How what was your early relationship with writing and reading?
I always loved reading. I was a big bookworm and I always loved writing too and wanted to be a writer. So I was one of those who was kind of like fated to this from the beginning.
Yeah.
Um, and I also always loved ghost stories and spooky stories. Although I haven't really turned to that in my writing until more recently, I guess. But I feel at home now. About to go to the Horror Writers Association conference, and I'm really excited.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, so that's how I started out. And then, as I got older, I read, a lot of like literary fiction and studied, um, writing in school. And but as I started getting into my own work, I took a lot of twists and turns, through different genres and blending genres.
Does that include twists and turns to different like careers? I mean, you said you said faded, and we're gonna say faded with a T, not faded with a
Yes.
D. Not that you faded into it like geez, it's all it's always left. But being fated to be a writer, I mean, were you always writing? Was that always the path, or was there like 5 years you took off or 2 years you took off?
No, I really, committed to it early. I never had much of a plan B. So
Right.
I did spend, years doing nonprofit work, but it was always a day job to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then when The Angel of Losses came out, I transitioned to teaching and some freelance writing and editing
Mm.
and, working on stories and books.
Yeah. Remind me the year of the Angel of Losses.
That was 2014.
2014. So even
Yeah.
so, a little bit before that, like as you got into high school and college, who were you reading? Who were some of those the chill-inducing writers, the ones who were thrilling, inspiring, and also probably kept you in awe?
Yeah. Well, when I was younger, when I was in middle school, really, I was a big Anne Rice fan,
Okay.
and I think that is still sort of in the back of my head. As I got older and started, studying writing and workshopping and all of that, I really loved authors like Jeanette Winterson and Sherman Alexie and
Mm.
Sarah Waters. People who are blending genre and speculative elements. And I always thought it was so amazing that people could do that because I love this sort of I love experimenting with departing from reality a little bit, even though I
Yeah.
was never firmly in the genre world. So those were the people who really inspired me.
Sherman Alexie, gosh darn it.
I know. I'm talking
Uh,
about his books. I have never
I know.
met the
I
man.
know, I know, I know, I know. He was one of my top, three,
Yeah.
five authors, and man.
I
Uh,
know. And I think like it's hard to bring it up, but the story collection, Tonto and the Lone Ranger, Fist Fight in Heaven, it really like opened up possibilities for me. And, whatever came out about him later, that that book still was an influence.
Yeah, no doubt about it. That was opening it up a lot of avenues, like you said. I think it's so true for me, just as a reader. I feel like you did definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't know a lot about Interview with the Vampires. Probably Anne Rice's most famous. Is that
Yeah, she has these witch books
okay?
I really liked.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Would I, not knowing enough about it, I mean, is there a lot of like allegory to be seen there? Or is it more just like plot and like scary stuff and vampires? Would you say that
You know what?
is there a lot of allegory, and B, like, did you see that from the beginning, or was it just like, oh, cool story?
I think what I took from those books is the atmosphere and world building.
Mm.
And I think what I loved back then was sort of being immersed in her sort of supernatural New Orleans.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And maybe that's feeding into what I did with Saturnalia, which is creating a kind of
Yeah,
supernatural Philadelphia and trying
definitely.
to make it as, to feel kind of real, but in a fever dream kind of way.
Well, you definitely succeeded. That's right on. I mean, obviously you would say it the best. That's the way that I felt about your Philadelphia. Yeah, it's we'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute, but it's just like, it is sometime in the future. It's universal, as in, uh it'll still be a great book in 10 years, 20 years. It's not like it was it'll be dated, but it's also of our time. It's just very you have such a light touch, and I sorry for the pun, but there's a lot of alchemy going on
Yeah.
in the way that you created that world. So that makes sense for Anne Rice. I know it's New Orleans, and like you said, she created such a it's world building. World building is such a skill that I'm so in awe of, that you do very well. As even into these more recent years, like who are you excited about when he or she's got a new book out or story out? Who are some of the writers who keep pushing you to be even better?
I love Sophia Samatar's
Okay.
books. She's written a couple of novels, a couple of fantasy novels. She has a great story collection. And just this past year, she had a memoir come out that is about her travels in Uzbekistan and about her
Mm,
heritage as a Somali American and also
okay.
a Mennonite. It's like a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah. So I'm sorry to interrupt you. I literally have about, like many of us, probably have 40 tabs open right now on this computer that we're talking on. And one
Yeah.
of them is that particular article about being a Mennonite in Uzbekistan. Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm getting more
She's
encouraged
just,
to read it finally.
yeah, and her writing is just so beautiful. And I was just talking to another writer about this too. Just I want to read a book or a story with great, beautiful sentences.
Mm-hmm.
And she always delivers that along with great stories.
Oh,
I also these days have been going back and trying to complete my reading of Jeffrey Ford's work.
okay.
And he's more in the fantasy and horror space, I guess. Um, but just he writes really like fantastic, imaginative, surprising, funny
Mm-hmm.
stories.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I appreciate that. Um, you talk about genre. So like I just talked with Robert Otone recently, who definitely writes horror. He's up for Bram Stoker in about a month or so. I've had the pleasure to speak to like Matt Bell and Allegra Hyde.
Yeah,
Matt Bell. I mean, all of them are incredible at world building. On the Robert was talking about how he also got a blurb from Paul Tremblay. Who's incredible
yeah.
in his genre or just outside of it. You have the blurb on the cover from the great Carmen Maria Machado. Man, so I guess I'm just kind of asking, like, where are you on that spectrum? Are you like, I'm not a horror expert. I don't feel like your book is, over the top,
Yeah.
machetes and this and that, but there definitely has that aspect. Where do you fall on that speculative horror, or does it matter?
Well, I guess there's two answers. So it matters when it comes to publishing and marketing a book.
Right, right, right. Got to put a label on it.
And yeah, and which makes sense. We need categories just
Mm-hmm.
as a shorthand, really, to try to talk about who our audiences might be and,
Mm-hmm.
the mood or the goals of a story. When I'm writing, though, I don't usually think in those terms.
Mm-hmm.
I I think about, the other books that I want to be in conversation with, or, the texts that I'm sort of like trying to fill in a little micro genre, I
Okay.
guess. And, so for Saturnalia, I was really thinking about, I really wanted to have this sort of tight, adventure that takes place over one night.
Yeah.
And I really wanted it to have these, it was all about the secret societies and the intrigue and the conspiracies, but also, how we can use them to talk about, like you said, what's happening in our world right now and the greater power dynamics. So in my own little micro genre writing space for that novel, I was thinking of books like Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum, and Louise Welch's Tamburlaine Must Die, which is about Christopher Marlowe trying
Wow.
to, he's a target of this conspiracy, and and it's a very short novel.
Mm.
So that was sort of my own like genre I invented when I was writing.
Mm-hmm.
I think of myself as a speculative fiction writer.
Yeah.
Most of my short stories these days are leaning more into horror, but kind of like gothic, spooky
Mm.
kind of work, not, psychological horror, not, like you said, slashers
Right.
or gore. Um, so yeah, I guess speculative fiction is such a broad term, but I think it's probably the best uh descriptor.
Okay. I appreciate that. So the book is Saturnalia, came out in October 2022.
Yes.
Right. I'd love to know some of the seeds for the book. Seeds. A lot of puns, a lot of puns. But just the some of the background. Was the book that was long in coming? Was it did it start out as a different, project? How did it come together?
Um, I guess I spent about 3 years on it. So there was this gap between my first book and Saturnalia, and I was working on other projects that just never came together.
Mhm.
And I started writing Saturnalia, or thinking about it really, in like 2017. And, if we can think back to that time, and there was a real, climate of fear and anxiety about the future because of the election and the administration. And then, climate change becoming, a more stark and immediate reality.
Mhm.
And so the book really started with me thinking about, how it feels when you have lost your faith in stability, right? And we don't know what's going to come tomorrow anymore. And I know, some people have lived with that, far longer than I did. But for me, that was the first time that I really felt like, wow, like I really don't know what could happen tomorrow, to, our neighbors, or my family, or, other people here in the city and in the US. And so that was, I guess, the big question that was driving the book. Like, what do we do with that fear? And the characters in the book respond in all kinds of different ways, right? And some
Mhm.
people try to double down and, grasp for power and protect themselves. And other people want to negotiate that uncertainty in, maybe a more like generous or optimistic way. And then at the same time, this was before the pandemic, but
I know,
was
right?
I was sort of like stuck at home because I have little kids.
Mhm.
And I was like, man, like I would just like love to go downtown to like a big party.
Mm.
And I had also just seen a performance of Poe's The Mask of the Red Death,
Okay.
which is about a whole bunch of rich people partying during like a plague epidemic, and
Whoa.
this mysterious figure that sort of hunts them down.
Sure.
Um, so I was thinking a lot about, money and power, and what people with money do when they are threatened, and
Mhm.
what the rest of us might do. Um, yeah, and then I just tried to make it fun.
Yeah.
Saturnalia's party. There are tarot cards and all kinds of other fun stuff.
Right. So, I mean, not that you can trace exactly, but it does kind of sound like it was more like the allegory came first, or the themes came first, and then it's kind of filling in the details. or was there did you have a pretty early handle on the subject, on the details, the party, the setting, Philadelphia?
That's a good question. I don't know what really came first, but I sort of ask these questions all at once.
Yeah.
Even as soon as I come up with a premise, in this case, a solstice carnival, secret societies,
Mm-hmm.
one particular character who has to like fight her way through it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also thinking like, why does it matter? What's the point of this story? What's going to give it emotional heft and meaning?
Mm-hmm.
And so I was at the same time thinking like, what matters here?
Mm-hmm.
And I try to do that with all of my writing projects, like to keep an eye on both aspects, right? Like the story elements that are going to power the narrative and make it compelling and interesting and exciting, and give it a structure and an arc.
Mm-hmm.
But also what matters to the characters and what matters to me as a writer, and all of these things can be fluid and change over time as I try to make it all fit
Sure.
together. But
Sure.
yeah, I always try to think about both of those things.
Mm. The epigraph is a short one, but you talked about Umberto Eco, and it's, quote, "An everlasting carnival does not work."
Yeah.
So it seems to me there's a lot of well, not seem there definitely is a sense of, like, I guess, hedonism for a lot of the characters, right? Where it's like they're, so you in the book you set up all of these, tornadoes and floods, and there's summer fever, there's like a climate disaster every month, which doesn't sound too fictional, right? These days,
Yeah.
the connection to, well, like marshlands outside of Philadelphia, and there's the settlements up in Canada, and there's the migrant camps that are kind of like impinging on, and they're refugees, and almost in a different way than we think of refugee now. Like, well, we do hear a lot about climate refugees, and there's just all kinds of disasters that are going on. And so some of the characters is just like, shoot, like, let's live it up. If the world's ending, party like it's 1999 type of thing. I wonder about that connection with the Umberto Eco. Was that one of the launching points, or was that kind of put in towards the end, like, oh man, this fits?
Um, I think I probably found that quote later on, but I was excited to find it because he had been one of the inspirations specifically for the alchemy. He has a sequence in
Mm,
one of his books with alchemists that always stayed with me, and I wanted to write my own version of it. And so when I found that line about the carnival, I was like, oh, this really like fits what the book is about. It's
mm-hmm.
that this is a system and a way of life that is not going to last. And are the characters going to face that fact, or are they going to stay in denial about it?
Mm-hmm. When you say this is not going to last, are we talking now like bigger things? Are we talking the way that the world uses so many resources, and climate change has been exacerbated, or do you talk, or like more specifically, like they're partying and going crazy that night, and
Yeah,
just
all of it, I
all the
guess.
above? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense. So you set up the Saturn. Well, going back a little bit more, there, Nina, right, the narrator, the main character, the protagonist. She's telling fortunes. She calls it, like, quote, the end of days. That her initiation gift into the Saturn Club was the Saturn deck, and it's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, most exclusive in Philadelphia. The Saturn Club. Um, so I'd love to know just about, like, the idea of telling fortunes, and just the Saturn Club, like how much you thought of Saturn, the mythical one, and what the Saturn Club really stands for.
Yeah. So I guess this fortune telling thing comes back to, something I was saying earlier about fear of the future and just like how desperately, I
Hmm.
mean, how desperately I would like to know what is going to happen
Yeah, 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 yeah,
tomorrow or next week or
yeah.
next year. And so that felt like a really, key device for getting at that. And,
Hmm.
she tells fortunes, but she doesn't necessarily believe
No,
in the deck, right? She thinks she's kind of a scam artist, and then maybe she changes her mind later.
yeah.
Um, so that's where the deck came from. And also, I love tarot. I'm kind of an amateur tarot reader, but I wanted to
Oh,
create my own. set of cards and symbols, just because I thought that would be fun.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool how the book has the five parts are based on so it's the drowning girl is first, and the Leyden jar, am I saying that right?
Yeah, Leyden jar,
Leyden jar, the
I think.
Sphinx,
Yeah.
the Sphinx, the horseman, the tree of life. But yeah, sorry, cut you off. But just the idea of like the background of Saturn and the Saturn in mythical times, and then the Saturn Club.
Yeah, so this also starts out in like a really like practical writerly place, because I knew I wanted the story to take place over one night during a big celebration. So it made sense to set it during the winter solstice, because that's the longest night, so then I have enough time.
Yeah, nice, nice.
Yeah, so I was like, oh, but I thought, that makes sense. And I started digging into solstice traditions, and that's how I ended up with Saturnalia, which was an ancient Roman festival.
Yeah.
Although there are solstice festivals from all over the world in different cultures that kind of, come back to these same,
Hmm.
sort of primal feelings about, it's cold, it's dark, um, we might be running out of food, or we're going into like a leaner time, but like, or coming out of a leaner time, and we're trying to remember that, there are longer and better days
Mm-hmm.
ahead. Saturnalia has a really nice ring to it. Even with my Philadelphia accent, we were talking about whether it should be Saturnalia or Saturnalia. I have to go with like my nasal East Coast thing. So then I thought, well, if I want to have this powerful, members only social club that helps organize the parade.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're going to be the best club, then they have to be the Saturn Club. And here in Philly, we have the Mummers Parade, which is a big New Year's Day parade. So I took some inspiration from that, but also Mardi Gras, and how Mardi Gras is organized by the crews. So I sort of borrowed those crews, and I thought, but what if I made them into elite clubs that maybe originally were more social or mutual aid organizations, but have now developed into these, organizations for the most elite to sort of network and shore up their power and show off. And they organize this big parade, but they also have their own, secret festivities.
To say the
Yeah.
least. Yeah. 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 So it's like, it's a night of revelry. It's it was pretty much back to normal the next day, right? But it's just like that night they have the I refresh my memory on the ruler,
the Lord of Misrule.
the Lord of Misrule, right? Like it's kind of like a nobody, it's everything is kind of flipped upside down in some ways, right? Um, when is the winter solstice is what, like December 20th, usually around there?
Oh, I should know that, right? I think it's usually like the 21st or the 22nd, but
Right
it could
around
be
that
the
time.
20th. It's right. It's like right before Christmas.
So like particularly we have Max. So Max is I don't know, former lover of Nina's times, never quite came together.
Yeah, like old friend that she sort of had a thing for,
Right.
and yeah, we learn more about their past.
Yeah. So she's down on her luck. We find out that 3 years earlier, she felt like she'd lost a lot of her dignity. She'd left the club. And at this time in the current time of the book, Max has paid her to retrieve some box. It'd be the first time she's going back to the club on the night of Saturnalia. There's also East, who she does have a history with romantically. He's the king, the Lord of Misrule that night. This idea of upending social norms, which thank you sent me down the Wikipedia rabbit hole. A lot of that happened in Roman times, right?
Yeah.
The kings or whatever would feed the slaves instead of vice versa, those type of things. There's a point where she narrates, Nina does, about there's no action but reaction. And I was thinking of Faulkner. I feel like it's been a telephone game over the years where I forget the exact quote at the beginning, but he talked about like the sound and the fury. And we read that in high school, and it was so hard, so difficult. And the professor at the end is like, well, you know what Faulkner was once quoted as basically saying, this book is about a girl who fell and like cut her pants or got her pants muddy, some of that effect, right? Sorry, long-winded way is that this book really, in some ways, is about her rape, right? I mean, in so many ways. I mean, that's almost where it begins and ends, right?
Yeah.
We find out later that that East had done that, and it was, it would be called what, date rape. I mean, it was somebody that she knew very well,
Someone that she loved. Yeah.
someone that she loved. And so I guess, that quote about there's no action but reaction. I just think about how much of this book, and you do it so skillfully, because it's not like this happens and then chronologically the rest of the book happens. It's all these back and forths, and we get to know a little bit more. The onion is unpeeled a little bit, peeled back a little bit. So I guess I'm just wondering about that. How maybe I'm overreading that quote, and it's fairly simple, but this idea of there's no action but reaction, how does that kind of govern some of the characters' actions and just the book's plot, I guess?
Yeah. So Nina, at the beginning of the book, she has escaped. She walked away from the club after what East did to her and left it all behind.
Mm-hmm.
And yet she's still kind of stuck in that past. It's kind of a false escape because she is she's still suffering. And, I guess in a way, she sort of withdrew from her problems, and her problems, have followed her. She's living alone in this small house that's kind of falling apart, and an outcast really of her own making. And so in the book, as she sort of faces the challenges of that night, where she has stolen this box that Max asked her to get, but she finds out what's in it and it's not what she expected.
Mm-hmm.
And now everyone's coming after her and she doesn't know who to trust anymore. There's that whole adventure unfolding, but as she, confronts it, she also has to confront her past.
Yeah.
And if in the beginning her life is sort of a reaction to what she experienced, I think by the end, she has sort of taken back her own agency, really, and to decide what kind of future she wants, not whatever present or future has been almost forced on her by others.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we're going to stay away from the plot spoilers. I'm sorry to say that about the rape, but I do think it's so crucial to talk about because it affects so many things in the book. And early on in the book, she talks about like this holiday is all about abandon and hedonism. And she says, literally says, if you get raped, though, it's your fault. And I took that at the time as just kind of generally, for any women or any people, but we find out her personal experience. But yeah, it's just I mean, it's such a morality tale is not the word, but I hate to keep using the word allegory, but just the idea of, as a man, I can't understand, but just a woman who is a victim of that, and how much, it affected like her relationship with Amparo, her friend, right?
Yeah.
And even with Amparo having, in her mind, legitimate reasons to be upset with Nina, the reader's just like, man, tell her what happened. Like, it's not your fault. It's not your fault at all.
Yeah.
That particular night when their friendship broke and everything like that. Just your book speaks so well to just the ramifications of the sexual violence that happens to her, right?
Yeah. And then it also takes place in, a world that's already very complicated when it comes to gender and power.
Yeah.
And, just being a member of the Saturn Club and trying to get ahead and climb that ladder is, fraught and complicated for the women in the book. How do you get ahead in a society or this institution that's been male dominated?
Mm-hmm.
And, that these are two, Nina and Amparo, they're two ambitious women, but ambition is really complicated for women too, because it's not something that we're sort of applauded for. And that, that's already complicating their friendship and their relationships with the other people at the club. And then if you throw on top of this, this assault that she suffers and how to deal with it. God, I haven't thought about it this way before, but it feels like kind of a trap. And I talked about Nina being trapped in her house in the beginning, and there's another figure that is literally trapped.
Yes.
And so it's hard. And I try to make it, I tried to explore just how complex it is. Like we were talking about Nina's relationship with East, and this was her boyfriend that she loved, but he also did a terrible thing to her. And just trying to figure out what does that mean, and Nina trying to figure out, well, what's my culpability in that event and that relationship, and also my relationship with Amparo. And it's like you said, you want to tell this character, like, just talk about what happened and just be honest with her. And I feel that too as the writer, but how hard it is for her because of all these other reasons. Yeah, I've sort of lost my place here a little bit, but that was a really important thing for me in the book too. As we talked about power earlier and money and resources, but also how gender figures into that as well.
Am I right? I mean, you talk about like the Saturn Club and these other clubs that we get to know, these social clubs that we get to know, and they have their histories and they have their their silences and all that. But it's like, it kind of safe to say even that like some of even the biggest time people are like, they're still even in the shadows. Like that they, like you talk some of the places we get to know, like the hill areas and the different neighborhoods. It
Yeah.
almost seems, these old men that you describe so well, like you describe them so well by not describing them, they're kind of just like a faceless mass. But
Yeah.
the way right, but the way you do it is so clever. So I guess just about like, yeah, I guess just a little bit more about what you're saying about power, what you're saying about maybe illusions of power, illusions with an I.
Yeah. I think, I was interested in power structures, but also, like you said, these hidden power structures.
Yeah.
We think we know who's in charge, but oftentimes it's like backroom deals,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or the people who maybe are not the face of, I don't know, the city government, or the face of, this lobbying group or this social group or whatever. But the people who have been accumulating power, a lot of it is about accumulating relationships too. And it's like local politics, and I don't, it in a partisan way, but also not a partisan way. But, Max is a figure who has power because he's sort of been cultivating friendships and making people feel indebted to him. And he doesn't like being in front and getting all the attention, but he can do a whole lot with the relationships that he's built. But then also like how petty it can be too, and when Nina finally faces some of these people behind the scenes and learns about their plans, she's like, this is what they're up to. Like, these are the people who, have all this power over me and everyone else. And what good is power? What's the right use for power?
Mm. Well, you're talking a little bit earlier about ideas of being trapped, and Nina writes about, or Nina talks about Philadelphia as being, quote, a big city to visitors and a small town to natives. And